This is Bloomberg Business Week Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week Daily. That is Emily Griffeo in for Carol Massar this afternoon. As I mentioned, well, actually, I think I said coming up next, it's Drive to the Close. I was a little confused. It's our cross-platform coverage.
Right. We
coming
just
up next.
We
did drive to the close. Yeah. So well, apologies if folks out there are confused.
They're waiting for that music.
They are. Well, they better wait for tomorrow. Did you see or did you hear President Trump talk about Jay Powell today?
No. So he was in a cabinet meeting?
Yep.
Where was he? Or in a social media post?
This is a cabinet meeting today.
Okay.
We were doing Bloomberg Crypto on TV. And we decided when he started talking about Powell to go over to him. And he had just made these comments. He said Jerome Powell should, quote, resign immediately if allegations from an administration official that the Federal Reserve Chair misled lawmakers prove true while deepening his personal attacks against the head of the central bank over interest rate policy.
He called Powell, quote, terrible, and told reporters that if allegations he deceived Congress over renovations to the Federal Reserve's headquarters proved true, it would be grounds for a swift exit. Trump really wants Powell. Is it about him wanting Powell to leave, you think, or it's really just about Trump wanting to get somebody else in there to cut rates, like someone who's going to just do whatever Trump says and cut rates? That's not really the role of the Fed chair, though. Their role is not to listen to the president.
Look, you read my mind, and they also don't act unilaterally. So just because the Fed chair wants to do something, let's say a Fed chair was in there who wanted to cut rates, if the voting members didn't agree, that wouldn't necessarily be the case.
This is what I would tell Trump. Do we need to cut rates so urgently? We've already had a couple cuts. The Fed markets are expecting a couple cuts this year. Like, even if we won't get one in July, we could still see them this year. The market is up. GDP is looking pretty good. Job market is healthy. Why do we so urgently need the cut? But I don't know.
I also think the Federal Reserve only has so much control. You see what the bond market does when it does or does not agree with a decision, not necessarily from the central bank, but we saw, in the words of the president himself, the bond market get a bit yippy back in April over concerns over his tariff policy, and reporting indicated that that indeed helped the president come to the conclusion that he should put that 90-day pause on those April 2nd tariffs. So I don't know. I think, look, this is not any different than what he said about Jay Powell resigning in the past few months. A reminder that he was the person who did appoint the Federal Reserve Chair during his first administration, and then he was up again during the Biden administration. President Biden at the time reappointed him, and he was confirmed by Congress. You did mention a social media post. The president did come out with a subsequent social media post. He accused the Fed chair of whining like a baby about non-existent inflation for months and refusing to do the right thing. Cut interest rates, Jerome. Now is the time.
And that was in all caps. I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know much about the Federal Reserve headquarter renovations. Our Bloomberg News writers have written that some media reports have asserted that the Fed's renovation of its headquarters has seen swelling costs and includes several extravagant features. And Fed budget documents for 2023 did attribute rising renovation costs to increases in raw materials. So the Fed is also not immune to, of course, rising inflation and commodity prices rising. So maybe that's why it was more expensive, but we'll have to tune back in.
Hey, just wanted to bring everybody a headline that we got in the last few minutes. The Supreme Court has let the president proceed with a broad workforce cut. The U.S. Supreme Court let President Donald Trump move ahead with plans to dramatically reduce the size of the federal government, lifting a court order that had blocked 19 federal departments and agencies from slashing their workforces. Granting a Trump request over one dissent, the justices on Tuesday cleared the administration to implement Trump's February 11th executive order, which opponents say could cause hundreds of thousands of federal workers to lose their jobs. More coverage on Bloomberg.com and the terminal. Coming up next, we're joined by our Bloomberg TV team for our cross-platform coverage. The closing bell starts right now.
The Closing Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostic alongside Shanali Bassick here to take you through that closing bell with the global simulcast. It has already started. There's Tim Stenovic in the radio booth, Emily Grafeo in today for Carol Masser. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms. An unchanged day on the S&P 500, Tim Stenovic, but a little bit more activity in the small and mid-cap space.
Yeah, Emily's been talking about the Russell 2000 all day today. We are seeing some activity there. I think investors still have a lot of questions about tariff policy. I've been asking our guests throughout the day today, are these letters providing more clarity? And one after one, people are saying not necessarily.
You know, it's funny. I wanted to look at the Russell year to date, and the little bit of a bid you're getting today brings you to almost flat. Now, isn't that a fascinating stat?
Also in the commodity space, there has been some movement. Look at copper prices up over 9% right now. Of course, coming after that tariff news from Trump, potentially a 50% tariff on copper.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the tariff news, I mean, we did see a big downdraft in stocks when we started to get some of those headlines. Some of that coming, of course, first from his social media site and then later at that cabinet meeting. And it really is just a reminder, Tim, of this idea that the tariff issue is far from resolved and still potentially poses a risk to the markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what, you know, the big question people have is what does the August 1st deadline think? I mean, we speak to folks every day who basically say, well, he hasn't necessarily followed through on these tariff promises. And we just spoke to Chris Brigatti over at SWBC, and he was like, this is one he's not going to extend. August 1st, that is actually going to mean something.
And if you listen to his comments at that cabinet meeting, and I actually really encourage people to go back and listen to it, a lot of rambling, but in between that, he did make some very salient points about his philosophy on tariffs and trades, of course, hearkening back to President McKinley, and in his view, how that tariff situation, in his view, worked out. Let's take a look at the numbers across the board. Not a whole lot of action there with the S&P and NASDAQ. We're just going to call it an unchanged. The S&P does have a red arrow, but only down about 4 points. The NASDAQ does have a green arrow, but only up about 6 points. The Dow Jones Industrial Average decidedly in the red, down more than 160 points or 0.4%. And the Russell 2000 decidedly in the green, up 14 points or 0.7%.
Still did have 269 stocks in the S&P 500 move higher today, whereas 231 moved lower.
Let's look at the sectors as well, because even though the sectors here show you a little bit of red on the screen, obviously it was enough to drag down the broader index here. You did have consumer staples, which was yesterday's gainer, and the relative safety trade in the market down more than 1% on the day. Utilities and financials also lower by almost 1% or more. Energy was your gainer. You had it up about 2.7% on the day. So very, very mixed trade, even though you had an index that showed roughly flat.
All right, let's get to some of the gainers today. I want to start with semiconductor stocks. I just went and chose the entire stocks, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index. We saw shares of semis rise today. The group outperformed as analysts expressed optimism about the group's prospects. Mizuho Securities raised its price targets on a number of chip makers. KeyBank Capital Markets also raised targets on a number of chip makers. If you look at the stocks right now, of the 30 stocks in there, 27 of them were higher, 3 of them were lower. Intel up 7.2%, Global Foundries up 7%. On the downside, Broadcom did fall 0.9%. Also, Emily mentioned copper stocks. I want to go with Freeport-McMoRan. The shares jumped as much as 8.8% earlier in the session. They moved lower after that Trump announcement at the cabinet meeting to finish the day down finish the day higher rather by over 2%. This after President Trump said he would impose 50% tariffs on copper.
Did you know there are people who collect like old pennies, you know, the ones that actually still had copper in them because they were anticipating a big jump in copper prices?
You know, it's funny you say that. I did not know that.
Okay.
But I did learn something about coins today, and I'm glad you brought this up.
What's that?
Charlie Pellet told me
oh gosh,
that in the US, we do not have the actual number of cents that a coin is worth on that coin. Like a dime doesn't say 10.
That blows my mind.
A quarter doesn't say 25.
And I don't know why, but it blows my mind.
Hey, you know what? We're a little different.
Yeah,
we're a little different.
We are America.
We are. Hey, I want to end with a stock that really had some serious outperformance today. Pro Kidney shares soared the most ever. Look at this, up more than 500%. Isn't this wild?
I've never heard of this.
It's a drug developer. It gave top-line results from a mid-stage trial of its experimental therapy to treat kidney disease. The company reported statistically significant and clinically meaningful positive top-line results from a full Group 1 modified intent-to-treat population of a phase 2 trial. And it was good news, and investors loved it. Look at this, up more than 500%, ticker PROK.
That is incredible, Tim. Let's go to the decliners, though. FICO, Fair Isaac, but known colloquially as FICO, fell 9% today after federal regulators said government-sponsored mortgage entities Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will be able to use an additional firm when determining borrowers' creditworthiness. So they were using FICO. Now Fannie and Freddie will allow lenders to use Vantage 4.0, their credit score, to increase competition in the credit score ecosystem, at least according to what the regulators had to say. Vantage is a private company, so we couldn't see how the shares performed, but we did know that this was weighing heavily on FICO. I'm also watching shares of Hershey, down 3%, closing the day. Yeah, down about 3.2% after some management changes. The snack food company named Wendy's CEO Kirk Tanner as its CEO, replacing Michelle Buck. This is going to be effective August 18th. The reason why the street was so negative on this is that Hershey announced back in January that Buck would be retiring in June of 2026. And so the timing of the appointment is somewhat surprising, and the transition was almost a year early, so shareholders didn't like that, so we saw that stock falling. And then finally, First Solar. It's been a wild ride here for the solar stocks. Today we saw First Solar down, closing the day about 6.5% lower after President Donald Trump called for new rules that would restrict access to tax incentives for solar and wind projects that were already pared back in that big, beautiful bill.
Some of the big individual movers there when we talk about the aggregate market and the lack of movement that we saw in the S&P 500. I'll one-up you and take a look at the bond market. Treasuries basically doing nothing today. Yields are higher across the board, but only by about 1 to 2 basis points as you pick your point on the curve here. So a little bit of stasis, and we should point out most of the activity in the Treasury market actually came during the European hours here. So it's basically been stasis for the last couple of hours here on the U.S. side. Tim.
I got a little bit of a New York-centric story here, but there's a little technology in it as well.
Does it involve rats?
It doesn't. No. New York City is one of the biggest ride-hailing markets in the United States. And now, if you're in New York, you might start seeing Google's Waymo vehicles driving around because they're starting to test them here.
Oh, yeah?
But they have people behind the wheel. They're just gathering data.
Yeah.
The company sent out a social media post. They said, be sure to give us a wave and snap a pic if you see us in the city.
That's what they said? Okay.
And you're not just giving the Waymo a wave. You're giving the person sitting in the driver's seat a wave as well.
Do they know we don't give waves here?
Yeah, I was about
in
to
New
say,
York
I mean, they're going to get a wave, but I don't think it's the wave that they're looking for.
Exactly.
So as somebody that drives daily in New York City, the problem is actually not the cars, right? Like, there's so many people.
It's the drivers?
And the people, right?
Okay.
I mean, jaywalking is a real thing in New York City. So it's a really interesting city to be trying this in. There are a lot of bikers, as you say, too. So again, I drive every morning in the city.
Can't trust those guys.
It's a lot to handle for a driverless car out there.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to this. I think anything possibly to improve traffic in this city, I'm definitely all for. I'm also keeping an eye on gold, Timothy. We were just talking about copper. But did you know that Tether, this is the big stablecoin issuer, basically one of the two big publicly traded ones out there, apparently they've been hoarding $8 billion worth of gold in a secret Swiss vault. And I'm glad it's secret, because if it was public, that would be trouble. But it really gets to this idea. This story really captured my attention because there's been all this talk about stable coins, of course, with Circle recently going public. And the idea that you can't have a stable coin unless it's, actually backed by real assets, presumably dollars, or maybe in this case, something that can be converted into dollars like gold.
But doesn't this answer a lot of questions about what was backing Tether or what is backing Tether?
Yes.
Hasn't that been a big concern?
It's been a huge concern for a while. And I think it's also when you look up the run-up that we've seen in gold prices, remember there was a big period where it just didn't make sense, economic sense, as to why you were seeing such a surge. And maybe this helps to start explain it. And it might not just be Tether. There might be a lot of other folks out there that have been doing the same thing.
You know, what happens then to the price or how much that stablecoin is worth if the price of whatever asset you have underlying it declines?
That's a good question. I don't know. Don't you host a crypto show?
I do. I was asking Shonali because she hosted with
Right,
me.
we've seen depegging, but you know, just another fun fact to leave in your minds, guys. Tether itself was the 7th largest buyer of U.S. Treasuries.
Wow.
Last year, even ahead of most major countries. And so safety, perhaps in gold, as well as treasuries.
I have a question, though. If I buy a stable coin, does it say on the coin how much it's worth?
There's no stable coin. Oh, gosh.
There it is.
That's a joke.
Tremaine always brings it back.
That was good.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. That is going to do it for our cross-platform coverage of the market close on Bloomberg TV, radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. We'll all be back tomorrow, same time, same place.
This is Bloomberg Business Week Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
It is Bloomberg Business Week Daily. That is Emily Grafeo. I'm Tim Stenivek. Emily in for Carol Massar this afternoon. Happy Prime Day.
Yeah.
Do people say that?
I don't know. I think we're kind of grasping for straws here, but yeah, I guess happy Prime Day.
I don't know. Happy Prime Days. Here's an interesting stat. Ed Harrison passing this along to us. Remember what he said yesterday about Prime Day sales? Watch them closely. Amazon's Prime Day sales fell almost 14% in the first 4 hours of the event compared with the start of last year's sale. This is according to Momentum Commerce. It manages 50 brands in a variety of product categories. Merchants and analysts alike are watching the sale closely for clues to the strength of the U.S. economy, as well as consumer sentiment. Also watching the sale closely, Bloomberg News technology and e-commerce reporter Spencer Soper. He joins us from our Seattle bureau. I like to call him our man in Seattle who covers Amazon and all things e-commerce. Spencer, is it fair for us to read into these first 4 hours, at least according to the data from Momentum Commerce?
Not really, because but we did anyway.
Okay.
Because it's a 4-day event this year, you know, as opposed to 2 days. So it's still interesting to see that out of the gate it was soft, but they've spread this over 4 days now. So the question is there less of a sense of urgency among shoppers, like, oh, that's a